Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the Megamachine with author Fabian Scheidler.
There's no one in control, indeed. And for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, there was a lot of talk about the greed of bankers. And I think this is highly misleading because, of course, they are greedy. But the problem are the institutions. We have greedy, unsustainable institutions. If you are the CEO of a fossil fuel company, of Amazon or whatever, or let's take a bank, the only objective of your work is to increase the shareholder value. So if you don't fulfill that function, you're out.
The delicate ecosystem of the Earth that sustains life and that took 4 billion years to develop is being exploited and destroyed by a vast global economic machine that produces mountains of consumer products, endless garbage, unheard of wealth for the ruling oligarchs. 42 men possess the equivalent of that owned by the poor half of the world's population, and misery for billions who live in poverty and insecurity. How did this global economic machine come to dominate our lives? And what, given the looming social upheavals caused by predatory capitalism, can be done to blunt its destructive power? Joining me to discuss these issues is Fabian Scheidler, author of The End of the Megamachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization. He joins me from Germany. So you use the term, which I like very much, megamachine, and it's not actually a physical machine out of the Industrial Revolution, but explain the term and what you mean by it.
Yes, the Megamachine, it's a term coined by Louis Mumford about 50 years ago. He wrote a remarkable book called The Myth of the Machine. And it's not a physical apparatus, but it's a form of social organization. Mumford uses this term also for the megamachines, the empires of antiquity. I use the term for the capitalist world system, which emerged 500 years ago. And it's a completely new system in human history. And because it's based on the endless accumulation of capital, it's based on endless expansion, it cannot stop. And people in this system are reduced in a way to cogs in a great machine that has to accumulate forever.
And yet you begin the book by looking back in antiquity and highlighting, I think, what we would call the antecedents that created that machine. Can you go through some of those? I mean, talk about the Greek and the Roman Empire and Sumer, but you say that there was a process. It didn't just rise like Venus on a half shell. There was a process that went into its creation. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So the first systems of domination emerged 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia with the city-states. And later this evolved into the huge empires, Greek empires, the Roman Empire, and so on. And these empires were based on what I call the four tyrannies: the tyranny of physical power, physical violence, which is the militarized state, among others, and the tyranny of structural violence, which is, for example, enshrined in property relations. There was a process of land privatization going on for thousands of years, leading to the state in the Roman Empire, where 6 people in the province of Africa possessed as much as half of the population. And so it was extreme concentration of wealth. And the empires, starting with the Greek empires, were based on mercenary armies. And silver was very important for this. So they used slaves to work in the silver mines. With the silver coins, they paid the mercenary armies. And these mercenary armies went abroad, pillaged other countries. And so with this money, they could pay more mercenaries and get more slaves. So it was a kind of machine as well. And this kind of system fell apart with the end of the Western Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, and it was reconstructed in a completely new way in modernity, or in the late Middle Ages. Again, silver was crucial, and firearms played a very important role in the creation of capitalism, because sovereigns needed a lot of money to buy mercenaries and to buy cannons, and they didn't have the money. So they had to borrow the money from the bankers and merchants in Venice and Genoa and so on. And so for the bankers and merchants, for the early capitalists, the business model was, well, we give money to the princes, they go to other countries, they pillage other countries, and from the booty, we get our return on investment. And this was also the motor for the colonial expansion since Columbus. All the people who went to South America, to North America, they were indebted and they had to pay back their debts to the bankers wherever in London, in Amsterdam, and so on. And so the modern mega machine is based on the endless accumulation of capital. That is one pillar. But the other pillar is the modern state. We very often hear the story that the market and the state are opposed. No, they have evolved in a co-evolutionary manner in early modernity. And one of the very significant examples of the combination of economic and physical power are the joint stock companies. The first one was created around 400 years ago in the Netherlands. And today, the 500 biggest corporations control about 30% of GDP and 2/3 of world trade. So they are the most powerful institutions. And the interesting thing about the first corporations is that they were heavily militarized. They had their own military. So they went to other countries. They used the military to subdue the people, to exploit the people. There are a lot of genocides committed by these companies in Asia and Africa and so on. And so the idea of the joint stock company is that it's like a machine. You pillage the world to pay for the shareholders like 10% of dividend, and the shareholders don't care what happens at the other side of the world. And so this is an extremely destructive model because these institutions don't have any social or ecological responsibility. Their only goal is to accumulate forever. And this doesn't work on a finite planet as we see today. So this really brings us into the current situation where the crisis of the biosphere that was never there in human history. I mean, the industrial civilization, the mega machine, has created the biggest extinction of species for the last 65 million years. And climate change is adding to that. So we are really in a situation in the 21st century where human survival is at stake.
I thought your point about coinage was kind of fascinating. I hadn't thought about it before as one of the fundamental pillars of empire. Makes complete sense, of course. You write in the book that when you talk about neoliberalism, you say it's the most recent phase of a much older system that from its inception roughly 500 years ago was founded on predatory exploitation. Neoliberalism is the ideology of the ruling elites, to simplify it, trickle-down economics, lack of regulation. But you really think that there's a kind of continuity to that ideology. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, neoliberalism was a reaction to a specific situation in the 1960s and the 1970s. First of all, there was a kind of global revolution, the 1968 revolution, which was really taking on all the pillars of power, on the military in the Vietnam War, on the economic system, and on the cultural side as well, on ideological power and so on. And so this was really dangerous for the elites because they saw that their foundations of power were just were endangered. So they thought of methods to get back the privileges and to secure them. And the second thing was that there was a deep economic crisis in the early 70s. I mean, New York City was bankrupt and Britain was also at the brink of bankruptcy. So the IMF came about and said, well, we can save you from this, we can give you new money, but you have to obey to certain rules, which was deregulation and privatization and so on. So neoliberalism was really a counter-revolution, if you like, to restore the power of the elites, which was there for 500 years. I mean, this is not new. Neoliberalism is just another word for the old capitalist system with a certain ideology which tells us, well, all that we see now, the social problems and the division between rich and poor, this is all natural because there are winners and losers. And this goes back to the very early narrative of to legitimize the capitalist system, which is the Calvinist ideology, which says, well, they're the chosen ones, those who are economically successful, and the damned who are not successful, they are rejected by God. And neoliberalism is something like a new version of this old justification. And so we are in a phase of rollback. The gains that the labor movement was able to achieve since the late 19th century are rolled back. But I think they cannot be rolled back to the state they were before. So we went back in history a little, but I think it's like we always go 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. And neoliberalism certainly is a step backward.
Yeah, although the labor situation in the United States, Germany has a more robust labor movement. Our labor movement has been eviscerated. Only 6% of the workforce is unionized. I want to ask, you say that the mega machine is not the first system in human history to fail, but it is by far the largest, most complex, and most dangerous. Why?
It's the most dangerous system because it's based on these 3 pillars, and it's based on endless expansion. First of all, the economic institutions, which I talked about, the corporations, they are based on an endless need to expand, to grow. The states are deeply connected to these institutions. The state is in no way a different institution which is able to control these corporations. For example, let's take subsidies. The IMF estimates that the fossil fuel industry is subsidized every year by $5 trillion. So the taxpayers are financing the destruction of the planet. So states are completely linked to these corporations, and most of the 500 biggest corporations, in fact, could not survive, including the banks, without huge subsidies, the aviation industry, the car industry, industrial agriculture, and so on. So this is a dangerous connection of these 2 pillars, which work together for endless expansion on a finite planet. And the 3rd pillar is ideological in nature. So for the last 500 years, we were told that this is the best civilization ever created. First, Christianity was used for this to tell us that we have the only true religion, so we have the right to go to any place to destroy other cultures and impose our way of life. And today it's the market or the free market ideology. However, there are no free markets. If you see the subsidies of the corporations, we don't live in a market system. Capitalism has never been a market system. So the problem is that if we don't change our institutions, the logic of endless accumulation, we will destroy our ecosystems in a way that we human species cannot survive. Just take climate change, which is only a part of the ecological crisis. We are on a path to 3 to 6 degrees centigrade global warming until the end of the century. The Paris Summit didn't change that much about that. And this means the Himalaya glaciers are going to melt, and if they are gone, 1.5 billion people in India and China and elsewhere won't have water in the hot season. This will mean that entire regions in the Middle East and in Africa will become uninhabitable. This will mean that coastal cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Jakarta, and New York City cannot be defended anymore. So this is a huge crisis without precedent. And to stop climate change, we have only 10 years. But even if we had an ambitious Green New Deal, which I would support, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have proposed, this will even not be sufficient probably, because if we replace, for example, conventional cars with electric cars, we don't solve the problem. Electric cars have a huge ecological impact. So we must move to a different economic logic, which is not to grow, replacing growth by distribution. we suffer from a huge overproduction in the industrial world. So we have to live better with less goods. And this demands really radical change in terms of distribution of wealth and income. So the ecological question and the social question are inseparable. Only through you redistribute wealth and income from the rich to the poor, you can change this overproduction process, and you have to change property relations, of course. So we need really a radical and ambitious agenda to prevent the worst from happening.
When we come back, we will continue our conversation about the Megamachine with author Fabian Scheidler. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about the global Megamachine with author Fabian Scheidler. So, who controls the Megamachine? Does the Megamachine control us? Isn't it in many ways beyond our control? If you don't serve the interests of the Megamachine, let's say you're the head of a huge fossil fuel concern, and you attempt to do the kinds of things that you advocate in terms of the distribution of wealth and the reduction of constant expansion, you're out. I mean, so who controls who?
Yeah, the thing is that there's no one in control, indeed. And for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, there was a lot of talk about the greed of bankers. And I think this is highly misleading, because of course they are greedy, but the problem are the institutions. We have greedy, unsustainable institutions. If you are the CEO of a fossil fuel company, of Amazon or whatever, or let's take a bank, the only objective of your work is to increase the shareholder value. So if you don't fulfill that function, you're out. It's that simple. You can be the best person in the world. You can have your eco farm or whatever. It doesn't matter. So the institution is the problem, and we have to change our institutions. We have to change the logic of our institutions. We have to undo what had been created 500 years ago, which I call the monsters of modernity. The joint stock company is one of them. So we have to create new economic institutions. And there are such institutions, for example, cooperatives and other municipal institutions which take care of healthcare, education, and so on. We have these institutions. But in the neoliberal era, of course, they were defunded. They were privatized and so on. And we have to get that back. We have to change also the big structures. Bernie Sanders, for example, proposed to nationalize the oil industry. I think it's a good proposal, but it is only the first step. So we have to not only to nationalize these institutions, because national enterprises act the same way very often. So it has to be taken in the hands of the workers. But even we have to go beyond this, because workers have egoistic interests, of course. So if you are a weapon manufacturer, and the workers will have an interest to produce more weapons. So there's a proposal of the economy for the common good, which says, well, these institutions should be run by a board with all the stakeholders, which means ecosystems should be represented. People in the global south should be represented in the decision-making process of huge enterprises. And so this would be a way to make sure that the decision-making process takes care of the planet and of other people.
I want to, when you talk about your four tyrannies, so three of those tyrannies: physical power, this is armed violence; structural violence, that's socioeconomic power; ideological power, exclusive mastery of writing, in our case, corporate control of the press and the news media. And you write that these three of the tyrannies are forms of power that, you quote Max Weber, are forms of domination, a relationship between people in which a commander can expect obedience. So talk about that. And I've taught at some of these elite universities like Princeton, where by the time you get there, you define your success in terms of how authority views you and rewards you. And I know that among German culture, this is a topic very much discussed, but it's very much a part of American culture. Talk about that idea that you quote from Weber.
Yes, for all systems of domination, you need a ruling class, and a class which is not only the upper 1%, but which is about 20% of the population. You have all these people in office who are responsible for the administration. And these people are very important. It's important that they go with the system, because if they don't, the system will fall apart. So you have to reward them. And this is a way to make sure that they keep in line. And in the 1960s and 70s, there was a very interesting development that many intellectuals turned to what Samuel Huntington once said, to intellectuals which were oriented in terms of values and not in terms of technocratic rule. This is in the Crisis of Democracy report of 1975 of the Trilateral Commission. And this report shows that people like Samuel Huntington in those days were very concerned that the elites turned away and exercised some sort of solidarity with the working class, with Native Americans, with Black Americans, and with all other people who were not part of the political process. So this is the most dangerous situation for the Megamachine, that some of the elites go with the demands of the subdued classes. And to make sure that this doesn't happen, so the elite university system tries to reproduce itself. And so only people from the ruling class will have those well-paid jobs. They will make sure that you are rewarded in any way, and not to look at the impacts of your class on the rest of the world.
Which captures the divide, the political divide now within the United States, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the American population, and also in Europe, large parts of the population are so disappointed. They feel that they have been betrayed, especially by the social democratic parties and the so-called liberal parties, because they had completely abandoned the working class. And there's a lot of rage against everyone who is seen to belong to that ruling class. And people like Trump, of course, used this situation to say, well, we drained the swamp. Of course, he was part of the swamp, as we know. But these demagogues, of course, they can easily play with this if there's no real political alternative. And of course, in the pre-election process, the only real alternative in the US, which was Bernie Sanders, has been destroyed. I mean, there were mistakes within the campaign maybe, but it was also the media system, as in 2016, which completely demonized Bernie Sanders. When he won Nevada in the pre-elections, there were people on CNN saying, well, this is either Stalin or Hitler unter Porter. So it was ridiculous the way he was demonized. And if you destroy any real political alternative, you will end up either with the right-wing demagogues like Trump, or with those centrist people like Joe Biden, who probably will do business as usual. But we have to be clear, business as usual is the way to the abyss. In ecological terms, we have 10 years to turn it around with climate change, and there is no real proposal on the table by Joe Biden to really achieve this. And with the social divide also, you cannot say, well, we do all the same thing as in the Obama era, there will not be Medicare for all. No, you have to have an ambitious social agenda, and frankly, I don't see that in the upcoming administration now.
In the afterword of your book, you talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the stresses that it's put on a system that is already so deteriorated that it can't handle these crises, including the economic fallout. I want to ask you, and you've seen the rise of a kind of powerful alt-right within Germany. What is the relationship between this alt-right, these fervent, rabid nationalists, maybe even proto-fascists, and the Megamachine?
Well, I think first of all, the COVID-19 crisis is really part of the ecological disaster that we are witnessing, because most of the epidemics and pandemics derive either from farmed animals in industrial agriculture, or from wild animals whose habitats have been destroyed by economic expansion. And COVID-19 is a serious disease, but there could be much more serious viruses like the avian flu or so, if we continue with destroying natural habitats. So this is a real issue. I mean, this is really also endangering the survival of humankind in the long run. And concerning the alt-right in Germany, it's not that strong as some people believe, because it gets a lot of attention by the media very well. Even if the left organizes very well, there's huge demonstrations with 300,000 people, there's not a lot of attention. We had like a couple of years ago, 5,000 years in the streets of Leipzig, and everyone was talking about it. So I don't say that it is harmless, but it's like 15%. And we have a lot of studies who say that 15 to 20% of the German population have always been more or less racist. So there's a continuity, but now they have a party, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. And in the COVID-19 crisis, some of these people mixed with people demonstrating against wearing masks or these measures. I think there's a lot of confusion, and the right is trying to use this situation to gain more support. The really dangerous situation now is that in the German institutions, in the police, in the military, there are a lot of right-wing networks, racist networks. And there were some migrants killed, for example, in police custody, and it was never really found out who was responsible. So this is really dangerous when the right enters the state apparatus.
And we have to close, but isn't this the ideological cover for the continued pillage of the Megamachine itself?
Yes, sure. I mean, the right wing doesn't do anything to prevent the ecological destruction of the planet. On the contrary, like in the US, they are almost denying climate change. They say we should go on as we did. And so the problem really also in Germany is that there are hardly any real alternatives on the political side, because the right wing is just precipitating the way to the abyss. And the centrists and the so-called social democratic parties, they just continue with their neoliberal program. So I think what we really need is a progressive agenda in Europe as well as in the US.
Great. And the only thing that thrives is the Megamachine itself. That was Fabian Scheidler, author of The End of the Megamachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization.